This week's SMB risk signals: router hygiene, genetic data, and agentic AI. The systems you trust most need explicit credentials, evidence, and approval paths. This is the SMB Tech and Cybersecurity Leadership Newsletter. On July 13th, 2026, CISA and a coalition of U.S. and allied agencies warned that Russian state-sponsored actors are still exploiting poorly configured routers across 6 critical sectors, often by abusing legacy SNMP settings and exposed management paths. On July 14, 2026, a 42-state coalition secured an $18 million settlement from 23andMe after a breach that affected 6.9 million consumers and exposed how weak multi-factor authentication, weak monitoring, and vague deletion controls fail under pressure. Also on July 14, 2026, I argued that agentic AI investments should be measured by useful work per dollar and governed before advanced workflows scale. These are not 3 unrelated headlines. They are one operating problem. The systems you trust most now need explicit credentials, evidence, and approval paths. If a router can quietly hand over configuration data, if a sensitive data platform cannot prove its basic safeguards were reasonable, or if an AI workflow scales before you can define who approves risky actions, the business is still running on trust it has not recently re-earned. Section 1. Router hygiene still decides whether an adversary gets a shortcut. The July 13th advisory matters because it is not about exotic 0 days. It is about weak operational hygiene on devices that sit close to identity, routing, and network control. CISA said the actors primarily scan for poorly configured networking devices, especially routers, and use SNMP weaknesses, Cisco Smart Install, and exposed management portals to get what they need. Here is why you should be concerned. 6 sectors were named: communications, defense industrial base, energy, financial services, government services, and healthcare. Legacy settings are still the entry point. The advisory says the actors look for SNMP agents that accept common or default community strings, then use those settings to copy device configurations and send them off network. And credential quality is part of network defense. The mitigation guidance specifically calls for strong, unique passwords, secure storage, and local accounts used only for emergencies. The strategic action is to treat routers, firewalls, and network device management paths as privileged systems, not background plumbing. If you cannot name who owns their credentials, firmware cadence, and emergency access path, you do not yet control the trust boundary they create. This week's leadership move is simple. First, confirm which routers, switches, and firewalls still allow legacy SNMP or broad management access from outside your management network. Second, require a named owner for every privileged network device credential and rotate any password that is shared in tickets, notes, or chat history. Third, ask your MSP or network partner to show whether Cisco Smart Install is disabled and which management ports remain externally reachable by exception. Section 2. The 23andMe settlement raises the floor for sensitive data discipline. The legal lesson from July 14th is not limited to genetic testing. It is about what regulators and attorneys general may now treat as the minimum reasonable standard when a company stores highly sensitive customer data. The 23andMe case turned a breach into a broad indictment of basic control failures. Here is why you should be concerned. The numbers are large and specific. The settlement announcement says the breach affected 6.9 million consumers, with some customer data later offered for sale on the dark web. Basic safeguards were part of the case. New York's Attorney General said investigators found failures around breached password block lists, multi-factor authentication, rate limiting, logging, monitoring, unusual login review, and known vulnerability remediation. And deletion rights stayed on the table. The settlement preserved consumer deletion rights and added new security expectations for the successor organization handling the data. The strategic action is to assume a future regulator, insurer, or board member will ask whether your basic safeguards were visible, enforced, and tested before the incident. I know many SMB teams inherit sensitive data platforms without a clean map of who owns account protections, retention settings, or breach detection. That is exactly why the control story has to be explicit now, before an incident writes it for you. This week's leadership move: enforce multi-factor authentication on every admin and customer support role that can view or export sensitive records. Check whether your identity stack blocks known breached passwords and alerts on repeated login spikes. And test your delete, export, and incident review workflow on one real system this week so you know who approves, who documents, and who confirms completion. Section 3. Agentic AI should be measured by accepted work, not excitement. OpenAI's July 14th guidance is useful because it frames AI modernization as an operating model decision instead of a model shopping exercise. It says leaders should judge AI by useful work per dollar. Tasks completed, time saved, decisions improved, and workflows ready to scale. Here is why you should be concerned. Model economics are moving fast. OpenAI says the price per million tokens fell 97% from GPT-4 to GPT-5.4, while GPT-5.6 delivered 54% fewer output tokens and 57% less time per task in the cited coding agent index. Cheap is not the same as effective. The guidance warns that the lowest token price can still create the highest total cost if the workflow fails, retries, or needs heavy correction, and governance is the operating layer. Leaders need to define what context AI can use, which tools it can access, what actions it can take, and who approves higher risk steps before advanced workflows scale. The strategic action is to avoid scaling agentic AI because it looks impressive in a demo. Scale the workflows where you can define the quality bar, the approval boundary, the evidence trail, and the cost of an accepted outcome. This week's leadership move: choose one workflow where AI can draft or review, but cannot complete the action without named human approval. Measure the cost per accepted outcome instead of raw token cost, and document what data the workflow can touch, who can raise limits, and what event triggers manual review. Final thoughts for leaders: router hygiene, sensitive data liability, and agentic AI governance all point to the same truth. The systems with the most leverage deserve the clearest ownership. The question is not whether these tools are useful. The question is whether you can prove who controls the credentials, who preserves the evidence, and who approves the action when the stakes rise. Put one item on next week's agenda. List the systems in your business that can quietly change access, expose sensitive data, or automate work across tools, and assign a credential owner, an evidence owner, and an approval owner to each one. Subscribe to access the premium implementation guidance, the control register, the checklist, the tabletop exercise, and the full strategy.